on to their next destination.
That's great. I'm so thankful you are here and joining us. Again, there's several other coordinators that weren't able to make it or that might be joining us a little bit late based on their availability, but I'm excited for these folks to be here. What I want to do is for everyone who's a participant, what would be helpful is you've named who you are and who you're connected to. If you could say something, there's going to be a poll that's going to come up. And in that poll, we're going to ask you just to get a sense of the group, where you're at in the process. So you've decided to host, you're talking with the decision-making making body about hosting. You're going to discern whether to host after tonight, or you're just beginning to think about this. So that'll help us know where you all are coming from. So as we get going here, if you could just answer that poll quickly, that'll help us get a sense of our crowd. All right, so our hope for tonight is, when we were kind of planning for this, we realized that we've been doing this, we've done this several times. And so each time we've gotten a little bit more complicated. And so we almost overwhelmed ourselves thinking about all the different things there is to say. And so rather than to not overwhelm you, the reality is this doesn't need to be as complex as we've made it, in the sense of we've just gone out of our way to have more and more people become involved in this process, and really bring a different levels of service around that, which you'll see, and care. But what I hope you walk away with tonight is that this is not overwhelming. It's not overly complex. It needs to be really, really simple, actually. And you can be really successful in being a welcome center without having all the resources or experience that we've been able to build over time. So that'd be my hope. And I'll say that the way that I'll reinforce that is just giving you a little bit of history, which is that we started this in 2019. And it came down to Jen and I were working together in the city on sanctuary and different things. And he got a call from a partner of hers and a friend of hers on the board named Ruben, who's the director of Annunciation House. And there was some urgency at that time in 2019 because of a large number of arrivals. And it basically said, hey, I know you're connected to churches there. We really urgently need to send a bus of families from the border, from mostly Central America. We're overwhelmed. Can you take a bus in Denver? So Jen called me. I happen to be in California. And within, I think, about 14 hours, we decided to become a welcome center, and we received migrants from the border. And so it was myself, and I asked 2 other volunteers that were part of our community, and then Jen and another friend of ours, Josh, and we made it to happen. So if you're watching this wherever you are in the process, and my guess is you've done something in this realm before, you're interested, I just want you to know that, like, it can be a little chaotic, it can feel like a lot, but you can do it, and you don't need to have, it doesn't need to be overly complex. And what it really comes down to is just creating a safe and stable environment for these folks. And I guarantee that if you can put into place some of the real basic realities of becoming a safe, peaceable place for folks to meet their basic needs, then you will create an environment that will be the most safe, relaxing, and peaceful environment that these folks have seen for months and months and months. So with that, Jen's going to talk a little bit about the group of folks that most likely are the situation that we were in, and then also the situation of folks who will be coming if you're in the Denver area or in the Colorado area, and just give you a sense of who they are, how they got here, and what's going on in their situation. I encourage you along the way that we're not going to throw too much content at you. And so as you have questions, just either put those in the chat or write them down, because we want to actually give most of our time to Q&A, because rather than throwing a bunch of details at you, we'd rather ask the specific questions that are bubbling up for you as we go into this. Sound good? So with that, Jen, why don't you take us to the next part?
Great. Thank you all for joining us again tonight. And like Dave said, I think we're trying to give you an initial context, and then we'll spend the second half answering all your questions. So really big picture, zooming all the way out globally, the root causes of migration right now are each day and each year getting more extreme. And so there are more people migrating around the world right now than in any other time in human history. And actually, most of them are not coming to the US. Many of them end up settling or staying in a neighboring country, or on their way to countries in Europe and Asia. So we have sort of a small chunk of the pie of humanity that is currently migrating around the globe. And that's just recently become more apparent and more local to a lot of us in the last month, as people arriving to the US have started to come to Denver as part of their migration route and their migration pattern. Part of the reason that we're seeing a shift in how people are migrating into the interior of the US is because of some very big picture policy changes that started about 6 years ago or 8 years ago under the Obama administration. In the second term, he and Secretary Clinton began detaining families in prison-like conditions, and that was supposed to be a deterrent for people migrating to the US. What we know about people's migration patterns is they're not so concerned about what our policies are at the border. They're more concerned about their survival and their well-being. So whether climate change, political violence, persecution, economic inequality are the reason people left their country, that's what drives them to take this really risky journey. Whether we have in place policies that deter them or not doesn't really change the number of people who are coming. It just changes how they enter the US and how humane and dignified that process is. So starting under Obama, we see a shift. And this is like the third big shift to try and undo asylum since we started asylum at the end of World War II. So it started under Obama, and then under Trump, we see a program called Remain in Mexico that requires people who want to apply for asylum to come to a port of entry, literally take a number, and then live in refugee camps until their court date. And those court dates were taking months or over a year for people, and they were virtual. So they didn't have any legal representation. They often, the interpretation was not always great. And then they would see a judge in the US over a very fuzzy camera, and that judge would see them over a very fuzzy camera. Unsurprisingly, most people lost their asylum claim and then were not allowed into the US. After COVID started, the Trump administration employed a public health policy called Title 42 that gives the executive the power to close the borders. And once the borders were closed to everyone, when they started relaxing those restrictions, they never reopened them to asylum seekers. So what that means is, instead of going to the port of entry and saying, I'm afraid for my life, and then being processed into the United States, going through a credible fear interview and then a court date, people weren't allowed to present at those ports of entry, and still aren't today. So then people started going to Border Patrol agents, crossing the border without an inspection, and finding a Border Patrol agent saying, I'm afraid for my life. So then the Border Patrol agents were, by and large, taking their asylum claim and doing that same process after people had done these risky crossings. Because that was successful, both Trump and President Biden then said, we're not going to allow people into the interior if they cross without inspection. And so what we're seeing now is people whose only option to access asylum is to cross the border without inspection and then come to a place like Colorado, get established in the interior, and then ask the Citizen and Immigration Services to process their asylum claim. We've basically shut the door and then said, if you can get in through a window, then you can try and apply. They still have to go through a credible fear interview. They still have to go through this long process. But their crossing has been made even more dangerous. So the folks who are coming to Denver right now are sort of seeing us as a building block or a potential stopping place on their journey. Most of them left Venezuela 4, 5, 6 months ago, long before any of these policy changes took effect, came to our border and were rejected, and then left by our government, stranded in Mexico, and then worked day labor or other jobs in order to raise enough money to make the crossing again. And then from El Paso or from Del Rio made their way to Albuquerque, worked in Albuquerque, or maybe a faith community helped them if they wanted to come west. And the next big city on that route is Denver, where you could buy a bus ticket that's affordable and sort of make the next leg in your journey. So about half of the people we're receiving now are deciding that they want to try and resettle in Colorado and integrate and make their life here. And the other half want to move on, whether they maybe have a loved one or they've just decided maybe I'll have a better chance in Chicago. What are people coming with? So they're coming with the things they've overcome or confronted to get here. They have a lot of coping skills, motivation, and strength because of that, but they also have a lot of scarcity and trauma. They have made 2 of the most dangerous border crossings on the planet just to get here, one through a jungle and one through a desert. And along the way have been targeted by all the governments of those host countries to be deported or expelled back to their country of origin. So that what we've found is the most meaningful and humane and effective environment to create is one of peacefulness and respect. And that in order to get there, clarity and repetition from us are key around what the norms are, around how resources are distributed within our welcome center, and being able to repeat that and knowing that people are asking again because of that clarity, that scarcity, and that trauma, not necessarily because they're trying to game us, but because they need a clear container in order to relax, to feel safe, to feel that they can trust that we're going to deliver on what we promise. So that I'm going to go ahead and turn it back to Dave to talk a little bit more about that ethos before we get into the nuts and bolts.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, the thing we start with the training of our shift supervisors and our leadership and the folks who are shift coordinators here. Let me say something quick about them real quick, just to understand that structure. I've called them 2 different things. We have folks on here who have overseen specific areas of emphasis, things like hospitality, donations, food. Those people also double as shift coordinators or shift leaders, we call them. And so at any given time, we have folks coming in for 4-hour shifts between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. And we try to have 2 on at a time. That's always our goal, is to have 2 at a time. It doesn't always work out, but we try to. And when those folks they wear a lanyard, and when they have the keys, they're sort of in charge. And so when we do that training, there's so many things to cover, but the reality is, the real basics of it is that we want our welcome center to be a place of peace. And so we feel like that starts with our shift leaders, that they embody a non-anxious presence. And because of what Jen just talked about, the anxieties, the trauma, all the things that folks carry into this place and the unknowns, it starts with the leader to set a culture and an ethos of peace. And that begins by embodying a non-anxious presence. Because if we get wrapped up and tangled up in all the anxieties and unknowns, and there will be many, that infects the environment of both our guests as well as our other volunteers who are part of the site. So we just try to say, we're problem solvers trying to embody a non-anxious presence. And the other thing is, the real basics are, we're just trying to create and maintain an environment that is safe, that is orderly, and that is trustworthy. safe, orderly, and trustworthy. And we have a real basic chain of command, and that in this our particular scenario, myself being our church owns the building. I've been in this work with Jen for the last couple of years. Jen and I sort of co-lead the over, I don't know what you'd even call us. We don't have names because hopefully they're not trying to flaunt our titles, but like we're overseeing things, and we're here to support these shift leaders and our coordinators. And then the next level below that would be these shift leaders and coordinators who are both overseeing specific areas as well as overseeing shifts. Some people, some on this call don't have specific areas that they're coordinating. They're just shift leaders, but just a shift leader is not a demotion at all. Like it's the most important person in the room because they're embodying that non-anxious presence. And whenever there's questions from a guest or from other volunteers that are with us, they're going to come to that person. And so they're the ones that need to kind of know what's happening and continuing to maintain that ethos. So there's a basic chain of command. They know that Jen and I have their back on anything, and they're empowered to make decisions in that place in those moments throughout the day. The other thing that we really talk about that's really important for our ethos is clarity. Clarity is love. Clarity is caring. We have found, especially in the last few months, that the folks who are coming in really have survived with the scarcity mentality, right? They're hustling for everything that they have. And they, as Jen described, they've crossed insurmountable paths and insurmountable challenges in order to get here. And so in light of that survival mode, they're bringing in the tactics and strategies that they've used. And so we found that we want to be really, really clear about what we can do and what we clear about what we can't do. So other things we've decided that we can do is we can create a place that's safe. We can create a place that's warm, a place where they can be clean, a place where they can get a warm meal and they can get food and nourishment. And we tell them that we can provide them with at least one additional set of clothes than what they've come in with. But beyond that, beyond those basic human needs, we don't want to guarantee anything more than that. And so we try to really be careful about with our training our volunteers and always being mindful of not continually saying, what do you need? What do you need? What do you need? Because that reinforces the reality that maybe we could meet all those needs. And we want to really under promise and over deliver. And so that we're consistent and safe about what we can do. So clarity is really important. And what we do want to repeat to them is you're safe, you're going to be okay. And we're going to help you come up with a plan for your next step, whether that's here staying in Denver or moving on to your final destination. Yeah, I think those are the really important things. So as questions come up for you, again, we can address more of those later, but I just wanted to kind of share those are basics on our ethos. I'm going to invite Amanda, who's one of our coordinators and shift leads, to share a little bit about this next part.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Welcome Center and just some of the resources that we had available at the Welcome Center. And I'm just going to check in with Dave to make sure that's what he was thinking I was going to talk about.
Yeah, you got it.
Perfect. Okay. So we made sure when we, for some of the resources, is having our volunteers together at the Welcome Center. And so I think a big part of that was making sure that we had a schedule that was equipped with Spanish speaking and also had space for non-Spanish speaking. So as a site supervisor, I am somebody who doesn't speak Spanish. I'm trying to brush up on my Spanish speaking a little bit. But that is really important to rely on people who do speak Spanish to be able to kind of help coordinate with our guests at the Welcome Center to make sure that they have what they need. I really like what Dave was saying too, and generally reinforce us about the clarity. And I think that we learned over time too, that it is when you have volunteers who come in and as a lead, like your first thing in making somebody feel welcome is you do always kind of want to ask, like, what do you need? What can I do for you? And then you kind of find yourself saying no a lot because there are a lot of things that we're not able to do that weren't really within the resources that we had at the Welcome Center. So what we could talk about is the shelter that we had. So we were really clear on how long people were staying at our Welcome Center. Typically when we've done this, our Welcome Center has been open for about 7 days. And that really is to help people get to their next leg of the journey. And so that was something that we had to really reiterate a lot. And the last time that we had people at the Welcome Center, we didn't always really know people's next steps. And so sometimes it might be like, we're working on that, we'll give you more information, or connecting them to their next travel plans and making sure that was coordinated, but not overpromising, and not saying, like, oh, we're going to figure everything out, but just kind of letting people know when that shelter was going to be open for, and that we were trying to work on coordinating the next steps. Food was really important, and so making sure that we had a schedule that was up that talked about our meal times and when food was going to be available, and we had volunteers sign up for that as well. And so they knew that every time that we had different meals, what time that was going to take place. And we did breakfast, lunch, dinner, and had snacks available for people, and had some structure kind of around meal times. We also tried to also have kind of some announcements around meal times so that people were kind of clear on maybe just some general things that were happening, maybe around laundry, or an activity or something that might be coming up the next day. And then for volunteers that would come to kind of as a site supervisor, what we would be responsible for was making sure that we had a monitor at the door. So kind of helping people who were coming in and out, and then also helping with the accompaniment. So kind of acting as that companion and making sure, I think Rebecca probably will talk about that a little bit later, but making sure that people were connected to kind of their companion who could help them address the specific needs that we were talking about. So maybe that would be around travel or some of the donation needs that people had, or just kind of answering some general questions. And that seemed to work out really well. And then we also had people who would be helping out with donations. And so we'd have, as a site supervisor, have some clarity to our volunteers about how donations worked, and being able to assign that out. And then just kind of the general cleanliness of the space, helping people around mealtime, and then also making sure that our facilities were clean, bathrooms, and often found out that people, the guests who were staying there, would often want to pitch in with meals, or even with helping to clean. I feel like sometimes when you had a broom in your hand, somebody was just taking that out of your hand, and doing the sweeping for you. And then, of course, helping with screening for health. I think that we found that a lot of people come with common colds. We also did some screening for COVID that came up. And so we had to make sure that we had supplies for that. We did have basic medical, kind of a medical cabinet available where volunteers were able to help out with providing people with the medications that were needed, like Tylenol or Advil or something like that, or cold medicine, and doing some assessment for that as well. And then one thing that we always tell people too, and our guests, is, and I think this is an important factor that I have learned along the way, is that we have a welcome center. We have a shelter for people to receive their meals, to have their bed, but they are free to come and go as they want. And so if people want to go outside to smoke, or if they want to go outside and look for jobs or do whatever they want to do, they have the ability to come and go to the welcome center as they please. Our doors are always locked. So just for some basic safety precautions, and we did have somebody at the door who was monitoring people who were coming in and out. But people are allowed to come and go. We did also have quiet hours that started. So we asked people to be back at around 9 o'clock, and did lights out at 9:30. But so did have some structure around that, but really we're not permitting or not permitting somebody to leave the building. And then the other thing that I think was really helpful and really important to keep my list here is the WhatsApp. We still use that chat all the time to talk to each other. That was so helpful to have as a site supervisor. So just a mechanism where your team, kind of your core team who is helping to run the welcome center or your shelter, has a way to communicate to each other as things come up. That's a lot to manage and kind of keep track of, but that's constantly asking questions, especially as you have people who are coming and going as site supervisors, for them to have a recap when they get there from the person before who is able to give them a rundown of what happened maybe on that previous shift. But that chat also was a way for everyone to stay connected. So even if you weren't there or coming in for a shift that day, you kind of know some of the things that might have happened the previous day. And you'll find yourself making a lot of last minute decisions. As much planning as you try to do, it is hard to anticipate all the needs that are coming up. And so as those needs are being, as they come up, as the questions come up, or just the new scenarios that you're kind of thrown with, having that platform or a platform to be able to get some quick answers or chat with your team is super, super helpful. And then the other thing that they had available too, or that we had available, was having just some like basic activities. So there were books that people had brought in, checkers. There was a TV, the World Cup was happening the last time. And so we thought, oh, that may be kind of fun for people to watch soccer. And so we had a TV, and it also had a Netflix account. And so people were able to watch TV. I mean, it is a lot of downtime, and being able to have a little bit of normalcy and opportunity for people to pass the time, we thought was helpful too. I think that's kind of a basic overview of the Welcome Center and kind of what happens. I don't know if anybody else from our team wanted to add anything to that.
Thanks, Amanda. That was a really good summary. And I think Rebecca was going to take a stab at just talking about a little bit, putting some of that in some categories, and then we'll get into some roles, descriptions, and then your questions.
All right, thanks, Jen. So just kind of thinking conceptually about what you can do in a welcome center. I think we can meet needs in some specific areas. So immediate needs can be thought of in kind of, we're meeting some immediate physical needs as well as some immediate relational needs. And then also addressing future planning for the next step of, are they traveling on to meet a loved one, or are they going to stay in Denver in our community? So talking briefly about those immediate needs, that's where some of the physical kind of realities set in, where we're looking at safety. Initially, is the facility ready? That door monitoring that we talked about. We had our guests wear name tags and have bracelets as just kind of an indicator that they belong in our center. And that helped the door monitor know, like, okay, yes, great, come on back in after your outing. And also give them still some security too, of like, if I leave, I'm going to come right back, and they know that I belong. And then also for in terms of safety, orienting people to maps and orienting them to the time of day. Also, another physical need that you can meet is in regards to security. So this includes, as we mentioned, food security and clothing, which really kind of touches some underlying currents, as Jen mentioned, with past trauma and anxiety around resources. And so we're doing this kind of logistical work of providing security, but also touching on some of those deeper currents that are also going on with our guests in those areas. Having a well-organized intake process also gives a sense of security, that folks know what's going on, and inviting them into ownership, as Amanda mentioned, that we're inviting our guests into participating in cleaning as they get oriented and feel comfortable, so that they feel a sense of security and belonging in that place. Medical needs are also the other kind of immediate physical needs that we addressed. So we have policies in place, and you guys, I think, have our documents around that. You can ask me more detailed questions at any time, but also just addressing any urgent medical needs in the time that they're going to be there and being prepared for those that might come up. And then the relational needs are some of the other kind of immediate needs that we addressed. And a lot of that is just really taking the time to have conversations and listen to stories, and just listen and be welcoming to that, and be okay with not always solving the problems, but validating the feelings that folks are expressing, and the fears and the hopes that they have, and giving an ear to that. And I think that's really some of the power of accompanying, and also the honor that we have in being a part of this. So those are kind of some of the immediate needs that we address. And then the future needs, as I mentioned, is assisting with the next steps. And that is including facilitating getting tickets, and we can talk about how that works later, but providing them transportation to transportation centers, or also connecting people with housing and jobs and resources in the Denver community. Thanks, Jen. Back to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Rebecca. So I think one of the things that we're hoping y'all will also consider is, as you can tell, this is a network that's developing as we move forward. First Unitarian has hosted some folks. Regis University is hosting some folks right now. There are a couple other of faith communities who are currently hosting. And so we're hoping that from your community, you're able to select one or two people who can be sort of our representative to this network as we learn and grow together. Each person who hosts, we learn something from each other, both about how to resource and also get resources from the city and the state, as well as be resources to one another and sort of grow our volunteer pools as we all enter into doing this together. So as you're talking with your community about potentially doing a welcome center, thinking about who could be in some of the decision-making spaces with the city and the state, and then also be in community with us, because we know we're all learning this as we're doing it. So that's one thing we really wanted to highlight that has been important in improving our response as a whole community together. And then I think the clear signups for volunteers, we'll share with you all a packet after this call. If you register for the call that shows what we've used. It doesn't have to be what we've used though, it's just for you to have an example, but something that has real clear signups. Having a decision-making team, that's who we call our shift coordinators, who are on the ground decision makers, and they kind of hold this big picture for volunteers and guests about that environment we're trying to be, the presence we're trying to provide, and who are problem solvers that are where the buck stops at that moment on their shift. And then we can always learn from those decisions and get better processes and support together. And then having volunteer role leads. So if there's a role that you want filled, and each welcome center is different because based on your resources, you'll offer different things. But if there's a role you want volunteers to fill, having a lead for that role. And the lead is charged with making the container for that role, orienting the volunteers that are going to do that role, and then coming up with a structure to communicate to people once you have people in the building what's needed. So communicating to those volunteers what they might need to bring or be aware of ahead of their shift. And then I think for donations, when we did this in 2019, we kind of said, these are all the things we need, and just let people drop things off. And we were pretty quickly overwhelmed. It actually took us several weeks after people stopped coming to Denver to dig out from all of those donations. So what we really encourage you to do is think about a system that defines what you need and what you want, and then find someone to manage donations who will say no gracefully. And we're going to have our donations folks talk a little bit more about what that looks like. And then we've already covered some of the other volunteer roles: accompaniment, food, transportation, medical, and maybe someone to bring in some nonprofit lawyers to do a little bit of legal orientation. And I think with that, we were just, I'm not sure, Dave, if there was something more you wanted to have people highlight from those roles before we kind of get into a little bit more question and answer. I know there were folks wanted to know a little bit more about what the shift coordinator specifically does. So yeah, I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, that's good. I can answer the question about the shift coordinators, and then I'd say we transition to a Q&A. Sorry, shift leaders. So what happens is, as I mentioned, from 6 a.m. until 10 p.m., those are our lights on hours, lights out have generally been from 10 p.m. Actually 9:30 p.m. We make that we let them overlap a little bit with the lights out hours until 7 a.m. in the morning. So 9:30 p.m. That was just our choice. You know, you could there's different ways to do it, but 9:30 p.m. till 7 a.m. have been our lights out hours. But our shift leaders come in starting at 6 a.m. and stay till 10 p.m. But they come in 4-hour shifts, so they work in 4-hour shifts throughout that time. We overlap those folks because they're basically handing off responsibilities to the next shift leaders that are coming in. So in our case, we have a couple closets, like our donation closet and an office space for volunteer stuff that we keep locked. And so they wear a lanyard with keys. And as I said before, those shift leaders are basically like Jen, I like she uses the language of container. I think that's really helpful. If this is a container that's a place of peace that we are charged with maintaining a non-anxious presence, then we charge those shift leaders with helping maintain that space and maintain that container, that safety, that peace, that non-anxious presence. That's their number one role. And then they also just need to understand the entire operation as far as what we're trying to achieve, the mission. And then, and what you'll find is that we're constantly problem solving. Again, everyone's going to have a little bit different scenario, because if you were perhaps working with a city or municipality and they said, hey, these folks aren't going anywhere, Denver's going to be their main home, you're not coordinating transportation for those folks. Others, you might be receiving folks, a mix of some who are staying in Denver, some who are not. So part of the ongoing sort of stewardship, or like accompaniment, as we call it, of those folks is being in constant conversation and actually having like basically case files for them that we create that are a little just basic demographic information of them and their plan. We found that they might come in thinking, I'm going to New York, but then a few days later, they've been able to be in a place of peace. They've been able to settle in, and suddenly they're going, actually, if I'm honest, my contact in New York is not that good. And so that's part of the gift of that hospitality that we create in that space, is not just keeping them safe and warm, but also being able to be like, okay, now that you're kind of more clear-eyed in this moment, you're realizing you don't have a good plan. Maybe staying in Denver is your best choice. So through the course of the week, the shift coordinators are all working together with a big different group of people, passing off notes. We have a clipboard that basically like we just write down random notes, almost like a charge nurse on the floor. We pass off to the next coordinator. When they hand off that lanyard and those keys, they're going, hey, here's the things I've been working on. Here are the issues at hand. There might be a medical thing. Someone has an appointment, arranging transportation for them. Another person is going to the airport. They're leaving. They're headed to Florida. All of those things that are happening, the shift leader is keeping tabs on, and then also orienting shifts of the accompaniment volunteers, which are our general volunteers that are serving the site that are coming in. So that's kind of the overview on what shift leaders do. There's probably more to say, and I can even let some of the coordinators chime in as well, but I think it'd be good to just jump into the Q&A time. Is that right, Jen?
Yeah, and I'm just going to take a step back. There were a couple of questions where I realized, probably because we started this meeting late, we jumped over. So Dave Newhousel and Joel Carman are both pastors and staff from a nonprofit called Project Renew that's a part of Denver Community Church. And so at their one of their physical spaces, they hosted folks in was it November, and then again in December this year, and then had done that in 2019. So they're all of the folks who have spoken except for me and Dave are volunteers from that faith community who engaged in this effort and were the shift coordinators and the leaders. So they're the folks who really did it. And that's why we're gonna have them answer some of your questions. That Welcome Center is a partnership of AFSC's volunteers, Casa de Paz's volunteers and resources, and then the Colorado Hosting Asylum Network that's been trying to help people who want to stay in Colorado integrate and resettle. And then there are there's 2 faith communities in Fort Collins and Larimer County that are doing this more broadly right now. And then, as I mentioned, First Unitarian also did this for, I think, 10 days. They had a welcome center, and I think they're planning to do it again. And in 2019, First Plymouth was a key partner who also opened their space. So the time commitment is, there was questions about opening and closing. So the time commitment is somewhat up to you and what's going to work in your space. We're really, after debriefing sort of December, we're recommending people try to shoot for at least a week, maybe ideally like 2 weeks, so that people who are, if you receive people who are looking to integrate and stay in Colorado, there's an opportunity for nonprofits and support organizations to connect and start to help people plan for that. Right now, the city is prioritizing people who have travel plans to go to these welcome centers and then stay safely until they can get on a bus. But we think that might change as we continue to see people who are trying to stay and aren't getting their needs really met, the attention they need to resettle in our current system, that we might see an ask shift to us hosting people who are trying to integrate and resettle, and then the city holding on to people who are going to travel on. But you can set some of those terms with the city yourself. So thinking yourself about what your faith community or your joint resources are on the front end and what would be doable for you, I think is really important. So I realized we didn't explain who we all were in very much detail when we started, and there were a lot of questions about that. And then I think the next question that folks had, someone talked about 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. shifts. What do you do for overnights? What's the situation from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m.? I don't know if anybody who did an overnight would want to talk about that role.
Avery could do that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. My experience with the 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift was usually really relaxed as a fire watch. So our facility required that we take note and walk around the building and say, nope, there's no fires, everything's okay, once an hour. So that was the gist of it. And then the rest of the time, people would come and ask for medications or snacks or whatever they needed. And so usually that was 2 people on at a time overnight. So it was a 10 to 2 shift and then a 2 to 6 shift, with one person awake and watching and interacting with people, and then the other sleeping. And I did one overnight at the very beginning of our time and one at the end. And I think our experience was that the needs overnight were greater at the beginning of people's stay. So that is definitely a more intensive night. There were lots of details to figure out, lots of kind of settling as all the people settled, and we finished a crazy day and tried to get everything in order. And once we had people Friday through Saturday, so a week or just over a week. And once the week hit, once Monday started, things tended to settle a little more, and that was really just a pretty relaxed sit and work on something else and be aware and awake if somebody needs anything kind of shift.
It may be at you all's facility that you have the fire prevention stuff that you don't have to do the fire watch that our location required, because we would have had to spend many thousands of dollars to not have to do that fire watch that nobody had on hand at the moment. So that will vary based on your site and the zoning conversation you might have with the city as you get ready to get started. Another question that people put in the chat is, what percentage of volunteers speak Spanish, or how do you plan for how many Spanish speakers to have at any given moment?
Do you want me to talk about that? Okay. we refined our accompaniment volunteer roles for the second time around, and I think it was really helpful. So we had 50 guests at our center, and so I think the numbers would change based on the number of guests that you had. But we kind of divided them into groups, like 4 groups, and then we had a Spanish speaker that was the accompaniment volunteer for that group for that shift. So we had basically 4 Spanish speakers per shift, and at least that was like the goal. And then at least one of the site supervisors was also hopefully a Spanish speaker too. And sometimes we had more, and maybe a few times we had less, but Google Translate was actually really helpful too. And we really encouraged our English speaking volunteers and site supervisors as well to still interact and communicate and use Google Translate or grab a Spanish speaker, because we don't want to create that distance.
After the first bus, we decided it's best to have at least 2 Spanish, like bare minimum 2 Spanish speakers on at a time, and then at least one of the overnight volunteers. So I think another kind of getting into how did things work, talking about meals, like how many people were served and how did we get food to our welcome center, and how did we manage what that food looked like, maybe what's important to think about when you're asking people to bring food. I don't know, Christina, if you would want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I can try to take that. Marcel is not here with us, but he was our main coordinator for the food. So we initially had a sign-up sheet for any volunteers who were interested in volunteering, and they're organized by the types of volunteering that you would be doing. So we had accompaniment, transport, food, donations, etc. So you could sign up to deliver food. We had food delivered at 3 times during the day. For breakfast, it was 8 a.m., lunch was noon, dinner was at 6, and it was all volunteer based. But I think at one point we had to cater something, but really it was all volunteers bringing food for our 50 guests plus the volunteers. So, maybe that was 60 people that were being fed at any one time. We learned over through the trial and error that folks from Venezuela and South American countries don't eat like the same food as Americans. It was shocking. But so sandwiches did not go over well. Nobody wanted peanut butter and jelly, and they actually hated peanut butter in general. But lots of just meat, beans, rice for practically every meal was what they would rather prefer. And so that did kind of, I wouldn't say limit, but maybe simplify our food that we were asking folks to bring in. There's also tons and tons of snacks. So they had enough snacks they could eat and graze at their leisure throughout the day. Generally not a lot of dietary restrictions or anything like that. So we didn't have to worry too much about that. Yeah, we did have some popular orders like Coke and other things. But I think that's probably all that we need to talk through with regard to food. I appreciate what Jen said about, trying to plan ahead so that because as the week goes on, you're going to have less and less guests there because they're going to be leaving and being transported to their next destination. So keep a tab on, the amount of people in the welcome center at any given time, and that can be a shift supervisor role to make sure that gets relayed back to the folks who are managing the food, and the folks who are managing the food can then, coordinate that as needed on the volunteer sheets. But generally speaking, those folks did not need to speak any Spanish. We did encourage any volunteers who were bringing food to also serve the food and, interact with our guests in that way. And that was, really beneficial. And then help to clean up after the meals as well.
And one of the questions in the chat was about coordinators and supervisors. It's the same thing. As you can tell, we need to all get on the same page about our lingo. So shift coordinator, shift supervisor, those are all the same thing. And my apologies for and site, those are all the same thing. Site shift, coordinator, supervisor, all that's the same role.
Hey, Jen.
Yeah.
Can I just clarify that a little bit too?
Sure.
Because we had coordinators in charge of intake, donations, transportation, accompaniment, kind of medical. So we have people who planned and organized ahead of time, and those are coordinators. And then the site supervisor is a role that occurs when we're actually like there at the Welcome Center and we have our guests, and the site supervisor is overseeing the shift. But yeah, we did complete the title, but there are coordinators who organized and sort of led these distinct areas, and then site supervisors who were like the manager for when we were there serving our guests.
Cool. Thank you for that. I think that was really helpful, Rebecca. There's also a question about, okay, so say my organization opens for 2 weeks as a welcome center. Do you receive like multiple buses? You get new people every day? Dave, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the decision that DCC made about what to say about the city, because the city would like you to just keep filling beds on their end so that they can keep people out of the rec center. But because our sites are all volunteer run, we felt like it might be better for us to consider a different option. So I don't know if you want to talk about what we have decided to do this last time.
Yeah, I was our primary liaison with the city regarding our shelter. And so what I found was you get to choose the boundaries you have, and I encourage you to choose them carefully. As Jen said, the city is not a fault. They're just overwhelmed. And so they're going to be like, can we just keep, if you said you can take 50 or the fire marshal says you can have 100, can I just keep 100 there all the time? So as soon as like 2 people go to the airport and leave, can we add 2 more? Because that's the level of urgency they're at. But I think that transience creates a lot of chaos. So it was helpful for us to say, we're going to start on this date, and you have an overflow of people that have arrived that day. For the people that have arrived that day, they've come in on buses or they've been identified by different people who've come to the welcome. There's a welcome center on 20th Street downtown, the city's using for that. You could say, hey, for this day, we're going to take 50 people. And you can in a rolling way have people coming, but I think it's really helpful to say, we're going to take our 50 and we're going to care for them for a week. Some of them are going to leave and they're going to be transitioning to the bus station to take buses or going to the airport. And that number is going to dwindle over time. I think that there's a lot of sanity in that because you're not doing new intake constantly. You're able to kind of keep tabs on people. But I think you need to just choose in your scenario. There's not a wrong way. I just think there's a more sane way for just creating order. And again, that clarity piece so that people know who's there. There's something about familiarity. If there's not people constantly coming and going, people feel more safe and secure. And so I kind of have a bias for having a very quantified front end, and that kind of matriculates throughout the week and changes until you get to the end, in which the end you need to be really finite about that as well. And then most likely they'll be transitioning back to another shelter in the city. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, Christina, did you want to say a little bit more on that point?
Yeah, I did. Dave raises a good point. I would agree with him in his in what he said. In terms of intake, I was one of the intake coordinators, and it is a monumental task to get all of the information needed from 50 people, and yet then think about trying to do that on daily or every other day basis is just to me overwhelming. It was really hard for us to just make sure that we even got the 50 folks. Often we found that we had left out a person, or didn't realize that so-and-so hadn't gotten an intake, and the intake process was really the key to the entire system. And if we didn't have them included in an intake, didn't have an intake form, it was very difficult to manage any of their transportation needs, or include them in any of the resource allocations for donations and things like that. So I think having a rolling intake would be just create an extraordinary amount of additional resource needs that you're your group would need to provide and be able to track in a much better way. We were just using simple Google Docs and a hard copy sheet that we had attached to the wall. That would be really difficult to do on a moving basis like that.
And I think I might just pause here for 1 second and kind of maybe just talk about the flow, because I think that helps me imagine. So the city is now doing they have the resources, and they've done it enough now that I hear from other people that them organizing and bringing who you're going to host is more organized than we had in December. So they'll bring you the bus of people or a couple vans of people. They'll have an estimated time that those folks are going to arrive. What we did is we had a Spanish speaking person sit people down in an area that's comfortable, say like, come into our space, use the bathroom, grab a snack, and then come back to these tables. And you really had to have your extra volunteers sort of help you get everyone at the tables, do a welcome message, talking about like, this is a place we want to create together peace and safety for everyone. Most of the folks here are volunteers. And so we really encourage you to help us create that space and lay some ground rules and norms. And then we would send people over to do a COVID test. At that time, we had some support from Denver Health to do those. I don't know if that's an option for everyone, but it's worth asking for. And then we had people pick their bed. The city will help provide cots and linens for the cots. So when you're talking with the city about, we'd like to move forward, we'd like to start doing this, those are some of the resources they can provide. And then we had them pick their cots and then immediately do intake. And then that's where we're at intake, they would get their first set of clean clothes, like new clothes, because most people only have what they crossed over with, which is not very much. Like people might have one change of clothes or no change of clothes when they get to you. So just having some initial comfy clothes that people could change into after their shower, and we'll get to showers because there's a question about that too. And really prioritizing intake and then rest. That's where we needed the bulk of Spanish speaking volunteers, was to do that intake, to really know, do you have any pressing medical concerns? Do you have an end destination? Do you have a contact? What's that contact? Do you already have travel plans? Some people do already have a bus ticket or somewhere they're trying to get. And then from intake, it was really, meals, and then just starting to try to do some of the case management that Rebecca was talking about a little bit earlier. So the front loading of Spanish speakers that first day really helps you out, because then you sort of know where everyone is at in that, at least for that day, in terms of staying or going and any big questions they have. And having those intakes be a place where people can ask some of their questions, like explaining to people what the neighborhood is like, and whether, what hours it's safe to walk around and things like that. So that's the flow. And if you were I know First Unitarian, they had a group of folks travel on, and then they took a second completely new group of folks during the time they were open, because they still had extra time from the commitment they had made. So again, that's kind of up to each site what that looks like. And then most of the folks we're seeing right now are traveling with other folks, and it's important to know that those folks have become their family. So some people actually are traveling with their brothers or their uncles or their kids or their partners. Other folks might be like 4 22-year-olds who met in Colombia on this migration journey and have become brothers. So really having that flexibility to have them do intake together and to treat them as a family group is really important. is another dynamic that's maybe not always obvious. We did have couples, so some couples, some single men, a couple families with kids all in the same space. We didn't have any like significant concerns come out of that, but part of what we did on the front end was say to people, like in the norms, if someone's not already your partner, like this is sort of not the space to hook up, right? like at this space, we're all going to be respectful of each other. Like no kind of flirting, no trying to find a new date inside the shelter was one of the things we set up on the front end or with volunteers, right? So I think that welcome really helps create a firm container for folks. That said, all the young 20-something guys were really fun. They had a really good sense of humor and really, I think, really flexible people. So not to be intimidated by them either. Cool. There is a question about space, like describing the maybe the ideal space and then like our actual space. Then I can say a little about First Unitarian space, like around showers and meal space. You know, what should people be thinking about and what's available in terms of options? I don't know who wants to take that. I just talked a lot, so I don't want to take it.
Maybe Joel, you mind talking about our space?
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. So as has been mentioned, we have a facility that we purchased a while back, this year or last year, 2022, and it's a gymnasium. It's actually just like kind of a dome shaped or like a semicircle kind of half cylinder gymnasium. And it's all pretty much one large space that was great for
Joel,
spreading out. Yes.
you're like me, you talk with your hands, but when you do, your volume is, you're kind of cutting out. Go ahead.
So our space is pretty much one large room, a big gym floor. Although it does have a couple things that made it a little bit more convenient for hosting, including one shower, which was constantly in use and constantly in need of cleaning, whether from guests or volunteers. And then we did augment that with some services from outside. So we were able to take some people on some shuttles over to rec centers for extra showers and things like that. But we also have a kitchen that's just directly off of the main space. And that allowed us to do things like if a volunteer brought in a meal a little bit early, we could keep it warm in the oven. Little conveniences, warming things up. We had a lot of leftovers that we're always trying to kind of work into the next meal. And really, beyond that, there was a couple rooms that we could lock. One for sort of volunteers and their belongings, and then one for keeping donated items organized and secure, so that those could be handed out in an orderly way and not causing like a kind of a rush or just so really there was a lot of limitations for getting our facility ready to use. We had to jump through some hoops to make that happen. Some people talked about, we don't have a fire suppression system in the building, so having smoke detectors is a step, but we did need to still have fire watch, so somebody basically monitoring for safety at all times.
Hey, Joe.
Yeah.
Something's really weird with your audio, and I apologize. There's like you're going in and out, and I have no idea why, but it's hard to hear.
Yeah. Okay. pretty much, I'm pretty
I
much
think you were pretty
done.
much there. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
sorry about that.
no, it's good. Yeah, and if you have specific questions about, I was going to say, the thing about facilities, and Jill actually gave a really good overview of what we're dealing with, but I think that the city will work with you on adjusting to what the spaces you have. And I think just like any scenario, whether it's all the assets of your community, you think about the number of volunteers you have, the kind of space you have, you kind of have to do a full assessment of all the resources you have. Yeah, my guess is there's a lot of really good assets that you have based on your space or your community makeup. But by working with the city, and also I'll avail myself because I went through the process of preparing our facility for use. I'd be happy to come over to look at your facility and walk through it with you and just think through all the different aspects of it. But I think in most cases, what we're doing is that just want you to know the city will work with you. It'll be as adaptable as they can within their policies. And every facility is going to have some positive and negatives. Your location is going to have some positive and negatives in the city. But those are all things that you can adapt and then find creative solutions to meet the needs, those basic needs for people.
And I think I just add, even at DCC's space, that we couldn't use the kitchen to like make food because it's not a commercial kitchen, but we could use it to reheat food. So that's another example of one of the adjustments that was made. And then I think there's a question in the chat about money for travel. So some folks have loved ones who can pay for their travel, although I think for this particular group of Venezuelans, that's less than folks from some other countries that we've hosted in the past. Right now, the city is paying for people's Greyhound tickets to their end destination. So part of the coordination of the intake is also communicating with the city about where people are trying to go. Now that the city has an intake center themselves, they often, they know what people have initially said, but that often shifts while they're with you. So I think it's just keeping them up to date, and we can share more some of the systems we created with the city to do that communication. But for now, you don't have to worry about fundraising for the money for travel because it's through the city, and because they have staff that are working through like everyone who's in the system trying to travel on. It will take more time than it would take for you to just book it. So just like being able to hold that and let people know each day. We had accompaniment volunteers that were Spanish speakers touch base with the people that were in their group. And I might have Rebecca talk a little bit about that, just to say, this is where we're at on travel. We know they saw that you want to go, and we've confirmed all your info. So we think they'll book it, in the next 24 hours, just keeping people in the loop of what's happening behind the scenes. Because otherwise it feels to them like they're just stuck, right? Like that they're being in motion has been what's kept them safe. And so if they don't feel like there's motion, they start to feel unsafe and neglected and impatient and forgotten, and have fear and scarcity. So those daily touch points, knowing every day at this mealtime, somebody's going to tell me where we're at, really brings down the level of like, what is happening with my stuff, energy for your volunteers and for them, the guests. So yeah, I don't know, Rebecca, if you want to talk a little bit about the groups that we tried this last time and kind of assigning people to a group. And then that might be our last question before we do a little bit of closing and explaining what resources we're going to be able to provide to you all, because I want to respect your time. I know we said we were going to close up around 7:30. So are you still there, Rebecca?
She's in the car.
Oh, sorry.
So we do Christina. Maybe Christina can respond to that.
Yeah. Can you talk about it a little?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So what we did was I think this morphed over time, but we sorry, I might be getting a little bit confused. You want me to discuss how we assign people into the accompaniment roles?
How we kind of grouped the cots into like a color,
okay.
and then had somebody
Okay.
who went with them each
Yeah,
day.
thank you. So the second bus that we received, we had we rethought this, and this is really Rebecca's brainchild, but so she did a great job kind of figuring this out for us. We had 50 cots, 50 folks, 50 guests, and we divided those up into 4 color groups. So red, yellow, green, blue. And so there's approximately 10 or 12 people per color. And we put name tags on each cot, and each name tag had a colored dot on it. And then when they were going through the intake process, we put the same colored dot on their intake form. And so if we had questions throughout the week that they were staying about, confirming their transport information, or confirming their contact here in the US, or confirming, where they want to end up, we knew what color code, what color dot they had. And so we could, each shift had an accompaniment volunteer that was associated with each of those colors. So we had 4 Spanish-speaking volunteers for each shift, for each 4-hour shift, and those were our Spanish-speaking accompaniment volunteers, and they were each assigned to one of those colors. And so we could say, hey, we need you to go talk to this gentleman who's in the yellow group. We need to have him come and talk to us about where his contact is or what his address is, because we think we got it wrong. So it was a really helpful way to pinpoint and help us kind of figure out where within those 50 guests we might need to focus our efforts, because we had such a, every 4 hours we were changing shifts, and it was really difficult for folks to kind of understand who was who, and so it really helped us kind of track people down a little bit better, and also helped the accompaniment volunteers kind of not divide up their resources so much. They knew who their 10 to 12 people were, and so they were really just keeping tabs with those 10 to 12 folks during their shift. So I think it worked out really well. And as people were leaving, those groups get smaller and smaller, and so maybe it requires less and less time from the accompaniment volunteers. They don't need to go around and checking in with everyone. Instead, we might just have them available in case people had questions over lunch or any of the meals.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. And I think that also helped people get answers to their questions more quickly, because even if the accompaniment volunteer didn't know the answer, they could go find it and then come back. There was also a question about the relationship between the welcome centers and immigration agencies. So there isn't one. And there's also not one between the city and immigration. Most of the people that, the vast majority of people, again, are essentially undocumented, and the government is, of course, they know there's a lot of people in Denver right now, but they don't individually know that someone is in Denver and staying with us. They don't have any reporting requirements. They don't have any contact. They haven't had any contact with the immigration this time entering the US. And I think it's good to be honest with that about with your community. The majority of people we talk to want to get on a path to status, are really motivated about it. That's a lot of what their questions are about. So there is a partner organization called the Colorado Immigrant Justice Legal Fund that Greg Mortimer runs, and he coordinated a bunch of pro bono attorneys to come in and just do individual initial consults with people for free, whether they were moving on or staying, to just kind of orient them to their rights. And I think that network of people wants to keep doing that. And right now, the access to do that in the city shelters isn't there. So we could connect you all with those attorneys and sign people up for slots. And then if the attorneys aren't available at AFSC, we have some really basic, not legal advice, but legal orientation that your volunteers could do with people. And then they just say like, I can't, you have to talk to an attorney. I can't answer any specific questions from you about your particular case. But even just letting people know you're not at the border anymore, so there aren't checkpoints, right? People have come straight from the border, so their context is that there's checkpoints everywhere where Border Patrol is catching people and sending them back. We don't have that in Denver. Letting them know that we can't guarantee that they won't be picked up by immigration, but that's not something that usually happens on the streets of Denver, so they can gauge their own risk level. Those kinds of things that we take for granted just walking around Denver every day, they don't have that context. They just came from a really militarized border that is looking for them everywhere. So giving them that context is also really, really important. I think at this point, we're gonna put our contact information in the chat, those of us who are comfortable being a resource, and we're also gonna share that out with you with a packet of some of our basic stuff. I think what you need to get started, which is the last question, is to take this information back to your community, take it through the decision-making process, and start talking with people in your community about who are folks that could be your initial group of, what did we cite? Supervisors. Those are and volunteer leads. Those are the folks that are going to be your core team. And I think the last thing I wanted to say is just that don't feel like you have to have all of the volunteers for this effort come from just your community. You could partner with another faith community. If you share your sign-up forms with us, we'll share them with our volunteer base. Because there's not any one center that's open all the time, there's a lot of folks who've really loved this experience and want to keep doing it. And right now, there's not an easy way for those folks to plug into the city shelters. So we can resource each other with our volunteer pools and make this an easier lift for everyone. So if you have the leadership folks that are the folks who are going to hold the big picture in this space, the site supervisors, and the volunteer coordinators or leads who are going to coordinate for each role you want, the rest we can help fill in. So I think to get started, it's like space, approval from your decision-making body, and then that lead team of folks that will carry out the work. And then the rest of it, we can help you. And the other last thing I'll say is, like, don't ever wait until you feel like you have every single thing, because you will never have it. Every single bus of the, I think it was 8 total buses, if you count the buses in 2019, had a different challenge and a different opportunity and different amazing moments. So jump off the cliff with us before you feel like you have everything. Please. I don't know, Dave, if you have anything else you want to say in closing, or anybody else who is a lead.
Yeah, I don't. I think that's really good. Just appreciate you all. There's 2,000 people in the shelter system now in Denver, migrants, and that's more than the number that we have on an ongoing basis of people just experiencing homelessness. So the need is ginormous. The city keeps saying every day, we're at capacity, and the capacity keeps getting squeezed. So I mean, been following this for the last, we're tracking with them for months, and there really is a huge need. So even though you might say, hey, we can only take 8, or we can only take 15 or whatever, but like, it's something and it's meaningful for those folks, and that respite is really, really critical. So anyway, I encourage you to do it. We'd love to help in any way that we can. There's so much more to say, of course, but I hope you've gotten a sense of the kind of the overall reality of this experience. And I will say again that, you know, like, we did it 3 years ago with about 12 hours notice, and it worked out great. So thank you all. Thanks for your time. Again, we have your email, so we'll follow up with a packet. It'll be an electronic document or a link to electronic file with like all things like intake forms, and as basic as like QR codes for Wi-Fi networks and sign-in sheets and, door lists and position descriptions for different roles we've talked about. You can take those things and use them for your purposes. They'll not be like in a PDF format. They'll be in a format that you can manipulate so you can use them as you wish. So thank you for your time. If you guys, any of the coordinators or shift leaders, if you're on, you guys can stay on for just a couple of minutes. We'd love a few moments of your time. But with that, I think that's a wrap.
Thank you all so much again for joining us.